Some wounds never heal, especially the ones carved by the people who should love us most. In the quiet farmlands of Lancaster County, 52-year-old Josiah Brenner knew that pain well, spending his evenings alone at a table set for one. Then, Ruth arrived, a woman her own mother called worthless, cast out and broken by years of cruel words. When the Amish community whispered she was damaged goods, Josiah saw her true heart. He offered her work and shelter when no one else would. But love between two forgotten souls doesn't come easy in a world ruled by gossip and tradition. Their growing bond would challenge everything the community believed about second chances and worthiness. Can two hearts the world has written off find the courage to choose love over fear? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather-bound Bible rested on Josiah Brenner's weathered oak table like an anchor in the morning light streaming through his kitchen window. 3 generations of Brenner men had turned its pages, their calloused fingers wearing smooth the edges of Psalms and Proverbs. His father's careful script filled the margins, dates of births, marriages, deaths, a family history written in fading ink. At 52, Josiah had added precious little to those pages. The rooster's crow echoed across his 100 acres as steam rose from his coffee cup, black as the rich Pennsylvania soil that had sustained his family for nearly a century. He'd inherited more than land from his father, the weight of expectations, the burden of carrying on traditions, the quiet disappointment of a bachelor son who'd let the family name rest on his shoulders alone. His boots found their familiar rhythm across the oak floorboards as he moved through the house his grandfather had built with his own hands. Every beam, every joint spoke of permanence, of families raised and legacies continued. The walls held echoes of children's laughter, of women's voices, calling men in from the fields, of Sunday dinners filled with cousins and conversation. Now they held only silence. Josiah pushed through the screen door onto his front porch, where morning glories climbed posts his father had set 40 years ago. The vines bloomed faithfully each summer, purple trumpets announcing dawn to an audience of one. He'd grown accustomed to solitude, found peace in the predictable rhythm of seasons, the honest labor that left his body tired and his conscience clear. The community respected him. Josiah Brenner, a man of few words but steady character. His farm produced the finest sweet corn in Lancaster County. His horses were sought after throughout the region, and his word was as reliable as sunrise. Yet respect and contentment were poor substitutes for the warmth of a wife's smile or children's voices echoing from the barn. He'd come close once. Emma Yoder, with her bright laugh and gentle hands, had walked beside him through 2 harvest seasons. The community had expected their banns to be red, their wedding to be the celebration of the year. But Emma's heart had wandered to his younger cousin, a charming boy with smooth hands and prettier words than Josiah could ever manage. The wedding did happen that autumn, just not his. That was 15 years ago. Josiah had buried the hurt beneath honest work and steady faith, telling himself that some men were meant for solitude, that the Lord had other plans for him. His fields flourished under his care. His animals thrived. His bank account grew steadily. Everything prospered except his heart. 3 miles down the county road, Ruth Hostetter stood before a cracked mirror in her mother's kitchen, braiding her graying brown hair with fingers that trembled slightly. At 32, she carried herself like a woman 20 years older. Her shoulders curved inward as if protecting herself from blows that might come at any moment. "You're late with breakfast again." Her mother's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Martha Hostetter sat at the kitchen table, her face pinched with perpetual dissatisfaction, surveying her daughter with the critical eye of someone who found fault as easily as breathing. "I'm sorry, Mother. The eggs are cold. The coffee's weak." And look at you, 32 years old and still braiding your hair like a child." Martha's words carried the weight of decades of disappointment. "No wonder no decent man would have you." Ruth's hand stilled on her braid. The words cut deep because they echoed her own fears. The voice in her head that whispered she was damaged goods. Too old, too plain, too broken by years of her mother's criticism to be worthy of love. She'd watched her younger sisters marry and move away, their mother beaming with pride at their weddings, fussing over grandchildren who visited less and less frequently. Ruth had remained, the unmarried daughter expected to care for aging parents, to sacrifice her own dreams for duty. Her father had been kinder, his gentle spirit a buffer against her mother's sharp tongue. But cancer had taken him 3 winters ago, leaving Ruth alone with a woman whose bitterness had curdled into something toxic. Martha blamed Ruth for everything: the doctor bills that had drained their savings, the failing health that kept her housebound, the shame of having an unmarried daughter at an age when most women had raised their children and settled into grandmother who. Ruth served breakfast in silence, her movements efficient despite the tremor in her hands. She'd learned to make herself small, to move quietly, to anticipate her mother's needs before they became complaints. It was a dance of survival, performed daily in the theater of their small kitchen. The Millers need help with their harvest. Ruth ventured, setting down her mother's plate. "Mrs. Miller asked if I might, so you can embarrass us further?" Have people whisper about how the Hostetter girl has to beg for work because she's too worthless to find a husband. Martha's fork clattered against her plate. "You'll stay here and tend to your duties. At least here your incompetence is private." Ruth nodded, swallowing the words that wanted to rise in her throat. She'd grown skilled at swallowing words, at pushing down dreams, at accepting that her life would be measured in small services and smaller hopes. But late at night, when her mother's snores echoed through the thin walls, Ruth would sit by her window and watch the stars wheel across the sky. She'd let herself imagine a different life, a house filled with laughter instead of criticism, hands that touched with tenderness instead of disapproval, a voice that called her name with love instead of exasperation. The Amish community of Lancaster County moved through its days with the steady rhythm of generations. Horse-drawn buggies rolled along familiar roads, past farms where corn grew tall and families gathered for evening prayers. It was a world that valued tradition over innovation, community over individuality, duty over desire. At Miller's General Store, the unofficial center of local gossip, women gathered to exchange news along with their purchases. The conversations followed predictable patterns: whose daughter was courting whom, which family needed help with harvest, who had strayed too far from accepted ways. "Did you hear about the Hostetter girl?" The whisper carried across the store like wind through wheat. 32 and still unmarried, living with that bitter mother of hers. "A pity," came the reply. "But what decent man would want damaged goods? They say Martha Hostetter's tongue could strip paint from a barn door. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The girl's likely just as difficult." These conversations followed Ruth like shadows, shaping how others saw her before they'd spoken a word in her direction. She'd become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened to women who didn't find their place in the proper order of things. Meanwhile, Josiah Brenner commanded a different kind of respect. His success spoke for itself in fertile fields and prosperous livestock. Church elders sought his counsel on matters of farming and finance. Young men apprenticed themselves to learn his methods. Yet, even his admirers whispered about his bachelor status, wondered what flaw kept such a capable man from taking a wife. The truth was simpler than the community imagined. Josiah had simply grown tired of trying to fit his square heart into the round holes of expectation. After Emma's betrayal, he built walls around his tender places, choosing the safety of solitude over the risk of further disappointment. His days began before dawn, ended after sunset. filled with the honest work that had sustained his family for generations. He tended his animals with gentle hands, coaxed abundance from soil that rewarded his patience, found satisfaction in work that bore visible fruit. But satisfaction wasn't happiness. And as autumn painted the maple trees in shades of gold and crimson, Josiah found himself pausing more often in his work, his eyes drifting toward the road that wound past his farm, wondering if the contentment he'd built was enough to sustain him through whatever years remained. Neither Ruth nor Josiah could have imagined how their separate lives of quiet resignation were about to intersect, how two souls written off by the world would find in each other exactly what they'd stopped believing possible. Love, they would learn, often arrives not with fanfare, but with the quiet persistence of morning light, transforming ordinary moments into something extraordinary. The stage was set for change in the turning leaves and cooling air of an October that would be remembered, not for its harvest, but for the seeds of hope it would plant in two hearts that had nearly given up on spring. The wooden sewing box sat beside Ruth's narrow bed like a faithful companion, its cherry wood worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, her few treasures rested in careful arrangement: a silver thimble that had belonged to her grandmother, spools of thread and colors that reminded her of spring gardens, and a half-finished quilt square she worked on during stolen moments of peace. The box had been her father's gift on her 16th birthday, back when he'd still harbored hopes that his gentle daughter might find happiness despite her mother's sharp tongue. "Every woman needs a place for her private things," he'd whispered, pressing the box into her hands while Martha bustled about the kitchen, unaware of the tender moment passing between father and daughter. Now, as October frost painted the windows with delicate patterns, the sewing box would become a symbol of everything Ruth was about to lose. "You worthless girl." Martha's voice cracked like a whip through the morning quiet. "Look at this mess." Ruth hurried to the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The coffee pot lay overturned on the table, dark liquid spreading across the oilcloth and dripping onto the floor. Her mother stood beside the wreckage, her face twisted with familiar rage. "I barely touched it," Ruth said quietly, reaching for a towel. "Let me clean. Don't you dare blame me." Martha's hand shot out, catching Ruth across the cheek with a sharp crack. 32 years I've fed and housed you. 32 years of watching you stumble through life like a broken-down horse that should have been put out of its misery. Ruth pressed her hand to her stinging cheek, tasting the metallic tang of blood where her teeth had caught her lip. She'd endured her mother's harsh words for years, even the occasional slap when Martha's frustration boiled over. But something in her mother's eyes this morning spoke of a deeper, more dangerous fury. "I try my best, Mother. I work hard. I help with everything. Your best isn't good enough. It's never been good enough." Martha stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Do you know what Mrs. Miller said to me yesterday? She pitied me for having a daughter so worthless that no man would take her off my hands." The words hit Ruth like physical blows, each one finding the tender places in her heart that had never quite healed. She built her life around the hope that someday, somehow, she might prove her worth to her mother. Now that hope crumbled like autumn leaves. "I never asked to be a burden, but you are." Martha's voice rose to a shriek. "You're a burden, a shame, a constant reminder of my failures as a mother. Every day I look at you, I see everything wrong, with my life staring back at me." Ruth felt something crack inside her chest, some final strand of hope finally snapping under the weight of her mother's cruelty. "Then maybe I should leave." The words escaped before she could stop them, hanging in the air between mother and daughter like a challenge thrown down. Martha's eyes narrowed to slits. "Maybe you should. Maybe it's time you learned what the world thinks of useless old maids who can't even make coffee without making a mess." "Fine." Ruth's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 32 years of swallowed pain. "I'll pack my things. You'll take only what you came with," Martha spat. "Which is nothing." But Ruth was already moving toward the stairs, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and something that might have been relief. In her room, she opened the cherry wood sewing box with trembling fingers, gathering her few precious belongings: the silver thimble, the colored threads, the unfinished quilt square, everything that marked her as something more than the worthless creature her mother saw. She wrapped the items in her second-best dress, tied the bundle with a piece of string, and walked back downstairs on unsteady legs. Martha waited by the door, her face set in stone. "Don't come crawling back when the world chews you up and spits you out," her mother said, opening the door to the crisp October morning. "You made your choice." Ruth stepped over the threshold and heard the door slam shut behind her, followed by the decisive click of the lock. She stood in the yard where she'd played as a child, clutching her small bundle and fighting the urge to pound on the door and beg forgiveness. Instead, she lifted her chin and walked down the lane toward the county road, each step taking her further from the only home she'd ever known and toward an uncertain future that terrified her more than her mother's wrath. Miller's General Store buzzed with the usual morning activity when Ruth pushed through the door 2 hours later. Her bundle felt heavier with each step, her resolve weakening as the reality of her situation settled in. She had $3 to her name, no family to turn to, and a reputation that preceded her wherever she went. Ruth Hostetter, Mrs. Miller, looked up from arranging apples in a basket, her expression shifting from surprise to pity in the span of a heartbeat. "What brings you out so early?" "I was wondering if you might have work," Ruth said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm looking for employment." Mrs. Miller's eyes took in Ruth's small bundle, the bruise forming on her cheek, the careful way she held herself. Understanding dawned across her features. "Oh, dear child," as Martha finally, "Please," Ruth interrupted. "I just need work. I'm a good cook, a hard worker. I can clean, mend, help with harvest." "Ruth." Mrs. Miller's voice was gentle but firm. "You know, I'd help if I could, but we barely have enough work for our own family." And with winter coming, the bell above the door chimed as another customer entered. Ruth turned to see Josiah Brenner's tall frame filling the doorway, his presence commanding attention even in his quiet way. She'd seen him at church, of course, knew him by reputation as a successful farmer who kept to himself, but she'd never spoken to him directly. Josiah's eyes took in the scene, Ruth's tear-streaked face, her bundle of belongings, the uncomfortable expression on Mrs. Miller's features. He understood immediately what was happening, had witnessed enough of these quiet tragedies to recognize desperation wrapped in dignity. "Morning, Mrs. Miller," he said, his deep voice calm and measured. Ruth nodded, her cheeks burning with shame at being caught in such circumstances by a man of his standing in the community. "I couldn't help overhearing," Josiah continued, his attention focused on Ruth. "You're looking for work?" "Yes, sir. I'm willing to do anything honest." From the corner of the store came whispers, other customers leaning close to catch every word of this unexpected drama. Ruth felt their eyes like weights on her shoulders, knew the story would spread through the community before noon. Josiah glanced at the whispering women, then back at Ruth. Something in her defeated posture, the careful way she held her small bundle of possessions, stirred a protective instinct he'd kept buried for years. "I need help with harvest preparation," he said, simply. "Cooking for the work crew, mending, general household tasks. Room and board included." The whispers stopped. Every person in the store held their breath, shocked by the impropriety of a bachelor man offering shelter to an unmarried woman, especially one with Ruth's reputation. Ruth stared at him, unable to believe what she'd heard. You would trust me with such work?" Can you cook for 12 men without burning the food or poisoning anyone? The ghost of a smile touched Ruth's lips. Yes, sir. Can you mend a torn shirt so it doesn't fall apart the next time it's worn? Yes, sir. Then you're hired. Josiah picked up his supplies from the counter, nodding to Mrs. Miller. Ruth, my wagon's outside when you're ready. He walked out of the store, leaving behind a silence so complete that Ruth could hear her own heartbeat. The eyes of the community bore down on her, some shocked, some disapproving, some curious about what would happen next. Mrs. Miller leaned across the counter, her voice low and urgent. Ruth, dear, you need to think carefully about this. A woman's reputation is already ruined, according to most folks. Ruth finished quietly. She shouldered her bundle and walked toward the door. At least now I'll have honest work to go with it. Outside, Josiah waited beside his wagon, the autumn sun catching the silver threads in his dark hair. He helped her up to the seat beside him without ceremony, clicking his tongue to get the horses moving. As they rolled away from Miller's General Store, Ruth felt the weight of curious eyes following their progress. She'd crossed a line this morning, stepped outside the boundaries of what was considered proper and acceptable. There would be consequences, gossip, speculation about what kind of woman would agree to such an arrangement. But for the first time in years, Ruth felt something other than despair settling in her chest. Whatever judgment awaited her, it couldn't be worse than the prison of her mother's house. And perhaps, in the quiet strength of the man beside her, she'd found something. She'd stopped believing in a second chance. Ruth's first quilt square lay on the kitchen table like a small prayer made manifest in fabric and thread. The stitches wandered slightly, not quite matching the perfect rows her sisters had learned to create, but the pattern was recognizable. A simple star design in blue and white that caught the morning light, streaming through Josiah's kitchen window. She'd started it her third night in his house, her fingers needing familiar work to calm the nervous energy that kept her awake. The guest room he'd given her was larger than any space she'd ever called her own, with windows facing east toward fields that stretched to the horizon. After years of sleeping in a cramped alcove off her mother's kitchen, the luxury of privacy felt almost overwhelming. That's fine work, Josiah said, setting his coffee cup on the table beside the quilt square. 3 mornings now, they'd share breakfast in companionable quiet, both testing the boundaries of this strange new arrangement. Ruth's cheeks warmed at his praise. It's not perfect. The corners don't quite meet. Perfect is overrated, Josiah interrupted gently. My grandmother used to say that the slight imperfections in a quilt were how you knew it was made by human hands, not machine. She called them love marks. Love marks. Ruth turned the phrase over in her mind as she prepared breakfast for the harvest crew that would arrive within the hour. 12 men who would spend the day cutting corn and loading wagons, their appetites sharpened by hard labor and crisp October air. She'd worried about cooking for so many, but her skills proved equal to the task. The biscuits emerged golden from the oven, the bacon crisp without being burned. The eggs cooked exactly as each man preferred after just 1 day of careful observation. Ruth, this coffee's strong enough to float a horseshoe, called out Heinrich. Lapp, the crew foreman, raising his cup in appreciation. Haven't tasted anything this good since my Anna passed. The compliment sent warmth through Ruth's chest. She'd grown accustomed to criticism, to having her efforts dismissed or found wanting. These men's simple pleasure in her cooking felt like sunlight after years of shadow. Josiah watched her move around his kitchen with growing amazement. In just 3 days, she'd transformed the space from functional to welcoming. Curtains appeared at the windows, fresh bread filled the air with its scent, and meals became something to anticipate rather than merely endure. But it was more than her domestic skills that caught his attention. Ruth possessed an intuitive understanding, a farm life that surprised him. She noticed when the milk cow showed signs of distress, caught problems with equipment before they became disasters, and offered suggestions that revealed a sharp mind behind her quiet demeanor. The south fence is sagging near the creek, she mentioned one evening as they sat on the front porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. I noticed it when I was gathering eggs this morning. Josiah nodded, making a mental note to check it the next day. Good eye. Most folks wouldn't catch something like that. My father taught me to watch for signs, Ruth said softly. He used to say that farms speak to you if you know how to listen. It was the first time she'd mentioned her father without the shadow of her mother's disapproval darkening her words. Josiah found himself wanting to hear more, to understand the woman who'd emerged from such harsh circumstances with her gentleness intact. Their evening conversations became a treasured ritual. After the crew left and the dishes were washed, they'd sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. The weather, the crops, memories of childhood, dreams deferred but not abandoned. Ruth learned that Josiah had wanted to travel when he was young, to see the ocean he'd only read about in books. He discovered that she could identify birds by their songs, a skill her father had taught her during long walks through woods and meadows. These conversations felt dangerous to Ruth, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. She'd never experienced such easy companionship with a man, never felt her opinions valued or her thoughts worthy of discussion. Each evening, she expected Josiah to tire of her company, to retreat to his study and leave her to her own devices. Instead, he seemed to genuinely enjoy their talks, asking questions that showed he'd been listening, remembering details she'd shared days before. It was a kind of attention Ruth had never received, and it both thrilled and terrified her. But the outside world wouldn't let them exist in peaceful isolation. By the end of the first week, visitors began appearing at Josiah's door with increasing frequency. Elder Marcus Weaver arrived on a Tuesday morning, his face grave with concern. Ruth served him coffee and retreated to the kitchen, but the men's voices carried clearly through the thin walls. Josiah, you know I respect you, but this arrangement is causing talk in the community. Elder Weaver began, his tone measured but firm. An unmarried woman living in a bachelor's house, it's not proper. Ruth is my employee, Josiah replied calmly. She earns her room and board through honest work. I'm sure her work is satisfactory, but appearances matter. People are saying, well, you can imagine what they're saying. Ruth felt heat climb her neck as she imagined the whispers that must be following her through the community. She'd known this was coming, had prepared herself for the judgment that would inevitably fall on her shoulders. People always find something to say. Josiah's voice carried an edge of steel, usually more about their own character than the subjects of their gossip. Elder Weaver sighed. Perhaps if you were to marry the girl, it would quiet the talk. The silence that followed stretched so long that Ruth wondered if she'd stop breathing. Marriage. The word hung in the air like something fragile and impossible. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a solution to gossip, Josiah finally replied. When I marry, it will be for love and commitment, not to satisfy the community's sense of propriety. Ruth closed her eyes, fighting the disappointment that flooded through her. Of course he wouldn't consider marrying her. She was damaged goods, a charity case he'd taken pity on. The growing warmth between them was friendship at best, certainly nothing that could lead to the kind of love he spoke about. After Elder Weaver left, Josiah found Ruth in the garden, pulling weeds with unusual vigor. You heard, he said simply. I did. Ruth kept her eyes on the earth, afraid of what he might see in them. I understand if you need me to leave. I never wanted to cause trouble for you. Ruth, look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her head to meet his gaze. His dark eyes held something she couldn't quite identify, regret, perhaps, or determination. You're not causing trouble. The trouble exists in minds that find sin where there is only kindness, scandal where there is only honest work. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I want you to stay, for as long as you're willing. The simple declaration hit Ruth like a physical force. Someone wanted her to stay, not out of duty or obligation, but because her presence had value, because she contributed something worthwhile to his life. I'd like that, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As autumn deepened around them, neither Ruth nor Josiah could have predicted how their tentative friendship would blossom into something more precious than either had dared to hope. But love, like the seasons, follows its own mysterious timeline, demanding patience from hearts that have already waited too long. The recipe book lay open on the kitchen counter like a window into Josiah's family history. Its leather cover was worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages yellowed with age and spotted with ingredients from countless meals. Ruth traced her finger along the careful script, reading her grandmother's notes about adjusting spices for her husband's sensitive stomach, a mother's practical love preserved in fading ink. My grandmother wrote most of these, Josiah said, standing beside her as the evening light faded outside the kitchen windows. Some go back to when they first settled here from Pennsylvania. Ruth turned a page reverently, finding a recipe for wedding cake written in a flowing hand. Someone had added notes in the margin, used for Anna's wedding, 1889, and perfect for Martha's celebration, 1902. These weren't just recipes, but family memories, celebrations, and gatherings stretching back through decades. She must have been a wonderful cook, Ruth said softly. She was. But more than that, she understood that food was love made visible. Every meal she prepared was an expression of care for her family. Josiah's voice held the warmth of cherished memories. I always thought someday I'd pass this book to my wife, watch her add her own recipes and notes. The unspoken sadness in his words made Ruth's heart ache. This book represented the family he dreamed of but never found, the continuation of tradition that had died with him as the last unmarried Brenner. Would you? Ruth hesitated, then gathered her courage. Would you mind if I tried some of these recipes? I promise I'll be careful with the book. Josiah smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. I'd like that. Grandmother's recipes deserve to be cooked by someone who appreciates their history. Over the following weeks, Ruth worked her way through the book with the devotion of a scholar. She prepared Grandmother Brenner's pot roast for the harvest crew, who declared it the best they'd ever tasted. She baked the apple strudel that had been served at Christmas dinners for 50 years, filling the house with scents that seemed to wake memories in the very walls. Each successful dish felt like a small victory, proof that she could contribute something meaningful to Josiah's life beyond mere employment. When she served his great-grandmother's chicken and dumplings on a rainy Thursday evening, Josiah closed his eyes after the first bite. That tastes exactly like my childhood, he said quietly. I haven't had it prepared that way since my mother passed. Ruth felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. For the first time in her adult life, she understood what it meant to nurture someone, to bring joy through the simple act of preparing a meal with love. But their growing closeness couldn't exist in a bubble. The community's attention on their unusual arrangement intensified as autumn progressed toward winter. At Miller's General Store, conversation stopped when Ruth entered. Church ladies offered tight-lipped greetings that managed to convey disapproval without saying a word. The confrontation Ruth had been dreading finally came on a crisp November morning when a delegation of women appeared at Josiah's front door. Mrs. Elizabeth Yoder, the bishop's wife, led the group with the authority of her position and the confidence of someone accustomed to moral pronouncements. Ruth Hostetter, Mrs. Yoder began without preamble. We need to speak with you about your situation here. Ruth dried her hands on her apron, steeling herself for what was to come. "Of course. Would you like to come in? I can make coffee." "This isn't a social call," Mrs. Yoder interrupted. "We're here out of Christian concern for your reputation and the scandal you're causing in our community." The words hit Ruth like physical blows, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet their judgmental gazes with as much dignity as she could manage. "I'm not aware of any scandal," Ruth said carefully. "I work for Mr. Brenner, earning my keep through honest labor." Honest labor. Mrs. Yoder's tone suggested she found the phrase distasteful. A young woman living alone with a bachelor man, no matter what you call it, creates the appearance of impropriety. "I'm hardly young," Ruth replied, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "I'm 32 years old, quite capable of managing myself appropriately." "Age doesn't excuse behavior that flies in the face of proper conduct," another woman added. "You're setting a dangerous example for younger women." Ruth felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on her shoulders, the same suffocating disapproval she'd endured from her mother for years. But something had changed during her weeks at Josiah's farm. She'd tasted respect, experienced kindness, felt valued for the first time in her adult life. The memory of those feelings gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. "I'm setting an example of a woman supporting herself through honest work instead of being a burden on others," Ruth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm sorry if my independence makes you uncomfortable, but I won't apologize for choosing dignity over destitution." Mrs. Yoder's face flushed at the implied criticism. "Independence? Is that what you call living off a man's charity while compromising both your reputations?" "I earn my keep," Ruth repeated firmly. "Every meal I cook, every shirt I mend, every task I complete pays for my room and board. If that's charity, then every employee in Lancaster County is living off their employer's charity." The women exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for Ruth's articulate defense. They'd expected shame and submission, not this quiet strength that refused to be intimidated. From the barn came the sound of Josiah's voice calling to his horses. Unaware of the drama unfolding at his front door, Ruth drew strength from his presence, from the knowledge that at least one person in the world valued her worth. "The community has certain expectations," Mrs. Yoder tried again, her tone slightly less certain. "Propriety must be maintained. Then perhaps the community should examine why it's more concerned with the appearance of impropriety than with actual kindness," Ruth replied. "Mr. Brenner offered shelter to someone in need. I provide valuable service in return. If you find scandal in that arrangement, the fault lies in your perception, not in our behavior." The delegation left shortly after, their mission clearly unsuccessful. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as they climbed into their buggy, their faces set in lines of disapproval and frustration. That evening, as she and Josiah sat on the porch, watching the last leaves fall from the maple trees, Ruth told him about the morning's confrontation. "I'm sorry you had to face that alone," Josiah said, his voice tight with anger. "They had no right to speak to you that way." "They think they're protecting the community's moral standards," Ruth replied, surprising herself with how calm she felt. "I suppose from their perspective, we are doing something unusual. Unusual doesn't mean wrong." Josiah turned to study her face in the gathering darkness. "You defended yourself well. I'm proud of how you handled them." Proud. The words settled around Ruth's heart like a warm quilt on a cold night. When had anyone ever been proud of her? When had she given anyone reason to be? "I learned something about myself today," Ruth said quietly. "I learned I'm stronger than I thought." "I could have told you that weeks ago," Josiah replied, his deep voice gentle in the darkness. "Strength isn't always loud, Ruth. Sometimes it's as quiet as getting up each day despite the world telling you you're not worth the effort." They sat in comfortable silence as night settled around them, both aware that something had shifted between them during the confrontation with the church ladies. Ruth had stood up not just for herself, but for their arrangement, their fragile partnership. She'd claimed her place in Josiah's household, not as a charity case, but as someone with value and dignity. The next morning brought the first hard frost of the season, coating the world in crystalline beauty that made everything look transformed. Ruth woke early to start breakfast, her breath visible in the kitchen's cold air. As she worked, she found herself humming a simple melody her father used to sing while working in his shop. Josiah appeared in the doorway as she pulled biscuits from the oven, their golden tops steaming in the morning light. "I haven't heard singing in this kitchen for 15 years, he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was being loud. Don't apologize." Josiah's hand briefly covered hers as she set down his plate. "This house has been too quiet for too long." The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent warmth shooting up Ruth's arm and straight to her heart. She busied herself with serving breakfast, hyper-aware of every movement, every glance that passed between them. After the harvest crew finished their meal and headed to the fields, Ruth and Josiah found themselves alone in the kitchen. The morning light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. "Ruth," Josiah began, then stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't come easily. "Yes? I want you to know that what happened yesterday, the way you stood up to those women, it meant something to me. You didn't have to defend our arrangement, but you did." Ruth felt heat climb her neck. "I was defending myself as much as anything. Us, maybe, but you called this your home, called yourself valuable. I've been hoping you'd come to see yourself that way." Josiah paused, his dark eyes serious. "Because that's how I see you. Not as an employee or a charity case, but as someone who brings light to places that have been dark too long." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Ruth felt her heart hammering against her ribs, torn between hope and the fear that she was reading more into his kindness than he intended. "I should," she stammered, reaching for any excuse to escape the intensity of the moment. "Ruth," Josiah's voice stopped her retreat. "I don't want you to feel pressured or uncomfortable, but I need you to know that having you here, sharing meals and conversations and the simple rhythm of daily life, it's been the happiest I've been in years." The simple honesty of his confession nearly undid her. Ruth gripped the edge of the table, fighting tears that threatened to spill over. "I never thought I could make anyone happy," she whispered. "My mother always said, your mother was wrong." Josiah's voice carried absolute conviction about everything. As the first snow began to fall outside the kitchen windows, dusting the world in pristine white, Ruth felt something shift inside her chest. The walls she'd built around her heart, fortified by years of criticism and rejection, began to crack. Through those fissures, hope seeped in like spring water, cold and shocking and absolutely necessary. Neither of them spoke of love that morning, but it was there in the kitchen between them, as real and warming as the fire in the stove. They were no longer simply employer and employee, no longer just two lonely people sharing shelter. They were becoming something more precious and more dangerous, two hearts that had found their match in the most unlikely circumstances. The plow handle cracked with a sound like breaking bones, the old ash wood finally surrendering to decades of use and the strain of winter preparation. Josiah stood in the field examining the damage, his breath forming clouds in the December air as Ruth approached with his midday coffee. "Can it be mended?" she asked, setting the steaming mug on a fence post and studying the broken tool. "It'll need more than mending," Josiah replied, running his fingers along the splintered wood. "This handle served 3 generations of Brenners. My grandfather carved it himself when he first broke this ground." Ruth heard the regret in his voice. the sorrow of watching family history reduced to broken pieces. She knelt beside the plow, examining the clean break where new wood showed pale against the weathered exterior. "The break is clean," she observed. "If we splice it properly, reinforce it with iron bands, it might serve a few more years." Josiah looked at her with surprise. "You know about tool repair? My father was handy with such things. He believed in fixing what could be saved rather than discarding it for something new." Ruth stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Shall we try?" They spent the afternoon in Josiah's workshop, a cedar-scented space filled with tools that gleamed from careful maintenance and regular use. Ruth proved surprisingly skilled at woodworking, her hands steady as she held pieces in place while Josiah shaped metal bands to strengthen the repair. "Like this?" she asked, adjusting her grip on the farmlands handle while he heated iron in the forge. "Perfect. Don't move." The forge fire cast dancing shadows on the workshop walls, and Ruth found herself studying Josiah's profile as he worked. His face was deeply lined from years of sun and weather, his dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. At 52, he was 20 years her senior, but his strength was evident in the easy way he handled the heavy hammer, the confident precision of his movements. He caught her watching and smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. "Penny for your thoughts." Ruth felt heat climb her neck. "I was thinking how capable you are. Most men would have thrown this old plow away and bought new. Most men didn't grow up during lean years when waste was a sin," Josiah replied, returning to his work. "My father taught me that things worth having are worth preserving." As he spoke, a fierce winter wind rattled the workshop windows, reminding them both of the storm brewing outside. They'd been preparing for it all morning, bringing in extra firewood, securing the animals in the barn, checking that the house was ready for whatever nature might bring. "Speaking of preservation," Josiah said, fitting the iron band around the repaired handle, "this storm looks to be a hard one. We might be snowed in for days." The prospect should have worried Ruth, but instead she felt a flutter of anticipation. Days alone with Josiah, no visitors to interrupt, no community members to judge their arrangement. Just the two of them and the peaceful rhythm of survival they developed over the months stopped by evening. Snow fell in thick curtains beyond the kitchen windows, already accumulating in drifts against the barn. Ruth prepared a hearty stew while Josiah tended the animals one final time, ensuring they had enough feed and water to weather the storm. He returned to the house with snow dusting his shoulders and ice crystals clinging to his beard. Ruth handed him a towel and watched as he dried his face, struck again by how natural this domestic intimacy had become. "Everything secure?" she asked. "As secure as we can make it. Nature will do what she will, and will adapt as needed." Josiah hung his coat by the door and inhaled deeply. "That stew smells like heaven." They ate by lamplight while wind howled around the house, testing every joint and board. But the structure held firm, as it had for generations, a testament to the craftsmanship of men who built for permanence. "Tell me about your childhood," Ruth said as they lingered over coffee, neither wanting to break the spell of intimacy the storm had woven around them. Josiah leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing distant with memory. It was different then. The community was smaller, families larger. This house was full of cousins and aunts and uncles during holidays. My mother would cook for days preparing for Christmas dinner. It sounds wonderful. It was. But it was also suffocating sometimes. Everyone knew everyone else's business, had opinions about every choice you made. When Emma, he stopped abruptly, the name hanging between them like an unexpected barrier. "Emma?" Ruth prompted gently. Josiah was quiet for so long that Ruth thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried old pain still sharp enough to cut. "Emma Yoder. We courted for 2 years. The whole community expected us to marry. I certainly did." He stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd stopped asking. But she fell in love with my cousin Thomas. Younger, more charming, better with pretty words than I ever was. That must have been devastating. It was. Not just losing her, but losing the future I'd planned. The children I'd imagined. The life we were supposed to build together. Josiah looked up, meeting Ruth's eyes. I convinced myself afterward that some people aren't meant for marriage, that God had other plans for me. Ruth felt her heart constrict. With sympathy, she understood that kind of disappointment, the way it could reshape your entire sense of what was possible. And now? She asked softly. Now I wonder if I was just protecting myself from more hurt. If I closed off possibilities because I was too afraid to risk my heart again. The confession hung between them, heavy with implications. Ruth felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the question he wasn't quite asking. The door he was opening just wide enough for her to glimpse the vulnerable man behind his careful defenses. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside, the kitchen, wrapped in lamplight and shared confidences, Ruth felt safer than she had in years. This was what she dreamed of during all those lonely nights in her mother's house. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. Not just survival, but the possibility of genuine happiness. I used to think I wasn't worthy of love, she said, surprising herself with her boldness. My mother made sure I understood that message early and often. Your mother was wrong about many things, Josiah said firmly. Was she? I'm 32, unmarried, living in a man's house without benefit of family or reputation. By any measure. By whose measure? Josiah's voice cut through her self-deprecation. Ruth, in the months you've been here, you've brought more warmth and joy to this house than it's seen in years. You work harder than any 3 people I know. Show kindness to everyone who deserves it and some who don't. If that's not worthy of love, then love has no meaning. Ruth stared at him, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. The word love hung between them now, spoken aloud for the first time, changing everything. Josiah, I know it's complicated, he said quickly. The age difference, the community gossip, the unconventional way we've come to know each other. But Ruth, what I feel for you, what's grown between us, it's real. It's worth whatever challenges we might face. The storm chose that moment too. Slam against the house with particular violence, rattling windows and making the lamp flames dance. But Ruth barely noticed, too focused on the man across from her, who just offered her everything she'd stopped believing possible. I feel it too, she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. But I'm scared, Josiah. Scared of hoping for something so far beyond what I ever thought I could have. Then we'll be scared together, he said simply. And we'll face whatever comes next one day at a time. As if in response to their mutual confession, the storm outside began to gentle, snow still falling but without the earlier fury. They sat in their kitchen, hands almost touching across the table, 2 hearts that had found their match in the most unlikely circumstances. The broken plow handle would serve for many more seasons, made stronger by their careful repair. Like the love growing between them, it proved that broken things could be mended, that what seemed ruined might simply need the right hands to make it whole again. The small tin box sat hidden in the back corner of Josiah's dresser drawer, nestled between carefully folded handkerchiefs and a leather-bound journal he'd kept since boyhood. Inside, wrapped in soft cloth, lay his grandfather's wedding ring. Simple band of gold worn smooth by decades of faithful wear. Ruth discovered it by accident on a crisp March morning while helping Josiah organize his winter clothes for storage. A shirt button caught the tin's edge as she lifted it from the drawer, sending it tumbling to the floor with a metallic rattle. I'm sorry, she said, kneeling to retrieve the box. I didn't mean to. The lid had come open in the fall, revealing the ring and a small piece of paper folded beneath it. Ruth caught a glimpse of faded writing before quickly closing the tin and handing it to Josiah. who had appeared in the doorway at the sound. His face went pale when he saw what she held. "Ruth, I can explain. You don't owe me any explanations," she said quickly, standing and smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "I was just helping with the clothes. I didn't mean to pry, but the damage was done." The ring's presence spoke louder than any words could a wedding ring saved for a bride, kept ready for a marriage that would never come. At least, not with her. "Please, let me explain," Josiah said, taking the tin from her trembling fingers. "This isn't what you think." Ruth forced a smile that felt like broken glass. "I should finish the washing. The clothes won't hang themselves." She hurried from the room before he could stop her, her chest tight with a mixture of embarrassment and crushing disappointment. Of course he had plans that didn't include her. Of course, a man like Josiah Brenner wouldn't truly consider marriage to someone like her, a woman without family, without dowry, without anything to offer except the labor of her hands and the devotion of her heart. Spring had arrived early that year, filling the air with the scent of apple blossoms and fresh earth. The season that should have brought hope and renewal instead highlighted every reason why their growing love was impossible. Ruth threw herself into her work with renewed determination, as if perfect meals and spotless floors could somehow make her worthy of the feelings she'd been foolish enough to develop. Josiah tried repeatedly to continue their interrupted conversation, but Ruth deflected his attempts with busy efficiency. She had washing to hang, gardens to plant, 100 tasks that couldn't wait. Each time he approached, she found somewhere else to be, something else that required her immediate attention. Their evening conversations, once the highlight of both, their days became stilted affairs full of careful politeness and unspoken tension. Ruth served his dinner with professional courtesy, then excused herself to work on mending or other solitary tasks. "You're avoiding me," Josiah said one evening as she cleared his untouched dessert plate. "I'm simply giving you space," Ruth replied, without meeting his eyes. "You must have much to consider." "Ruth, please, just listen for 1 minute." But before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Through the kitchen window, they could see a fine buggy rolling up the drive, its occupant clearly someone of importance based on the quality of his horse and tack. "That's my nephew David," Josiah said with a sigh. "Martha's boy from Philadelphia." Ruth had heard Josiah mention David Richardson, his sister's son, who'd made his fortune in commerce, and regularly tried to convince his uncle to sell the farm and move to the city. She'd never met him, but from Josiah's descriptions, David considered rural life quaint at best and barbaric at worst. David Richardson proved to be everything Ruth had imagined and worse. Tall and expensively dressed, he swept into Josiah's kitchen with the confidence of a man accustomed to having his opinions matter. His eyes took in Ruth's simple dress and work-worn hands with barely concealed disdain. "Uncle Josiah," David said, embracing his uncle with the calculated warmth of someone who wanted something. "You look well. Country life must agree with you." "David, this is Ruth Hostetter, who helps manage my household." "Miss Hostetter." David's acknowledgement was perfunctory, already dismissing her as unimportant. "Uncle, I need to speak with you privately. I have news that might change your perspective on your situation here." Ruth excused herself to the kitchen, but their voices carried clearly through the thin walls. "You can't continue this charade," David was saying. "Living with an unmarried woman at your age, it's unseemly. And the financial implications. Ruth is my employee. Please, Uncle, I may live in the city, but I'm not naive. The whole county is talking about your arrangement with this woman. It's damaging your reputation, and by extension, the family name." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd known the gossip continued, but hearing it laid out so bluntly made her situation painfully clear. "I have a proposition," David continued. "Sell me the farm. I'll give you fair market value, plus Enough to set you up comfortably in Philadelphia. You can live like a gentleman instead of working like a common laborer. This land has been in our family for 3 generations, and it can be in our family for 3 more, just under different circumstances. Uncle, you're 52 years old. How much longer can you maintain this place? And what happens when you're gone? The land goes to me anyway, eventually. Ruth pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting nausea. David was right about one thing. Josiah had no direct heirs, no wife or children to inherit his legacy. The farm that meant everything to him would pass to a nephew who saw it as nothing more than a commodity to be sold. I need time to think, Josiah said finally. Of course, but don't wait too long. I have investors interested in developing this area. Land values won't stay high indefinitely. After David left, promising to return in a few days for an answer, Josiah found Ruth in the garden, mechanically weeding vegetables that didn't need attention. You heard, he said simply. I did. Ruth kept her eyes on the soil, afraid of what her face might reveal. He's not wrong about the gossip, or about the family name. Ruth, you should consider his offer, she said, standing and brushing dirt from her hands. You could have a comfortable life in Philadelphia. Find a proper wife, someone who could give you children to inherit your legacy. Is that what you want? For me to sell the farm and move away? Ruth finally looked at him, seeing the pain in his dark eyes. I want you to be happy, to have the life you deserve. And what about what I want? What about what would make me happy? Before Ruth could answer, another buggy appeared on the road. This one shabby and familiar. Ruth's blood turned to ice as she recognized her mother's thin form hunched over the reins. Martha Hostetter had come calling, and Ruth knew with sickening certainty that whatever brought her mother to Josiah's farm, it wouldn't be good news for anyone involved. The 3 forces that would shape their future, David's financial pressure, the community's moral judgment, and Martha's vindictive interference, were converging like storm clouds on the horizon. Ruth felt the happiness she dared to claim slipping away like water through her fingers, and she wondered if love could survive when the whole world seemed determined to destroy it. The legal document lay spread across Josiah's kitchen table like a map to a country Ruth had never imagined visiting. Attorney Samuel Patterson's weathered hands smoothed the pages as he explained their contents, his voice careful and professional. In the afternoon light streaming through the windows, your father was quite specific in his intentions, Miss Hostetter, Patterson said, adjusting his spectacles. This will was filed with my office 3 years ago, shortly before his death. He was most concerned that it be kept confidential until the proper time. Ruth stared at the document, her hands trembling as she read her father's familiar script. The words seemed impossible, like something from a dream she might have once dared to entertain. I don't understand, she whispered. Father left me nothing. Mother told me. Your mother knew about this will, Patterson interrupted gently. She was present when your father signed it, though she contested its provisions afterward. The law, however, was quite clear. Martha Hostetter sat rigidly in her chair, her face a mask of fury barely contained. She'd arrived an hour earlier, demanding that Ruth return home immediately to care for her, as is proper and fitting. When Patterson had appeared shortly afterward with his leather satchel and grave expression, Martha's demands had turned to desperate attempts to maintain control. Tell him, Martha, Patterson said, his tone carrying the weight of years of legal practice and human nature. Tell your daughter what she's inherited. Martha's lips pressed into a thin line, but she remained silent. Your father left you half ownership of the family farm, Patterson continued, turning to Ruth. 57 acres of prime farmland, the house, the barn, and all livestock and equipment. Additionally, he established a trust fund from the proceeds of corn and dairy sales over the past 15 years. The total value is considerable enough to make you financially independent for life. Ruth felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Half the farm? But Mother always said, your mother retained half ownership and full management rights until such time as you claimed your inheritance. Patterson explained. She was also designated as trustee of your fund with authority to release money for your support as she saw fit. The implications crashed over Ruth like a cold wave. Her mother hadn't been supporting her out of grudging duty. She'd been using Ruth's own money while keeping her daughter in poverty and ignorance. Every harsh word about being a burden, every cruel reminder of her worthlessness, had been built on a foundation of lies. How much? Ruth asked, her voice barely audible. Patterson consulted his notes. The trust currently holds approximately $8,000. Your half of the farm is valued at roughly $15,000. You are, Miss Hostetter, quite a wealthy woman. Martha finally found her voice, though it came out as a harsh croak. She doesn't know how to manage money. She squander it, lose everything her father worked for. The trust includes provisions for that concern. Patterson said calmly, Mr. Hostetter appointed me as financial advisor, with authority to guide Miss Hostetter's decisions until she feels confident managing her affairs independently. Ruth looked at her mother, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time in her adult life. She saw not the intimidating figure who had dominated her existence, but a frightened old woman whose power had just evaporated like morning mist. Why? Ruth asked, though she wasn't sure if she was addressing her mother or her father's memory. Why hide this from me? Because you would have left, Martha said bitterly. With money of your own, you'd have abandoned me like everyone else. I gave my life to raising ungrateful children, and what did I get? Daughters who married and moved away, leaving me with only you. And you? Her voice broke with something that might have been genuine anguish. You would have left too. The truth of it hung in the air between them. Ruth would have left, would have found her own place, made her own life. The money would have given her choices she'd never known existed. I stayed anyway, Ruth said quietly. Even without knowing about the inheritance, I stayed and cared for you. Doesn't that count for something? Martha turned her face away, unable, or unwilling to acknowledge the devotion she'd inspired through cruelty rather than love. Josiah, who had remained silent throughout the legal proceedings, finally spoke. What happens now? Patterson gathered his papers with practiced efficiency. Miss Hostetter can claim her inheritance immediately. The farm will need to be managed jointly with her mother, or one party could buy out the other's share. The trust fund is available for withdrawal at her discretion. After Patterson left, the three of them sat in stunned silence. Ruth felt as both Mayhews. If she'd awakened in someone else's life, where she was wealthy instead of penniless, powerful instead of powerless, free instead of trapped. You'll come home now, Martha said finally, her voice lacking its usual authority. We'll manage the farm together as your father intended. Will we? Ruth asked, and for the first time in her life, the question held real power. Will we manage it together, or will you continue to treat me like an unpaid servant who should be grateful for scraps from her own table? Martha flinched as if struck. I am your mother. You are a woman who used my father's love for me to control us both, Ruth said, her voice growing stronger with each word. You stole my inheritance and used it to keep me trapped, convinced I had nowhere else to go. The words felt strange in her mouth, honest words, true words, words she'd never been able to speak before. Money, she realized, was more than currency. It was choice, independence, the power to say no. Ruth, Josiah said softly, what do you want to do? She turned to look at him. This man who had offered her shelter when she had nothing, who had treated her with respect when the world saw only damaged goods. Now, she had more money than most people in Lancaster County, could buy her own farm, hire her own help, live exactly as she pleased. I don't know, she admitted. This morning, I was a penniless spinster dependent on your charity. Now I'm She gestured helplessly at the space where the legal documents had been. "I don't even know what I am now." "You're the same woman you were this morning," Josiah said firmly. "Money doesn't change your character, your kindness, your worth as a person." But even as he spoke, Ruth could see something shift in his expression, a new wariness that hadn't been there before. She was no longer the vulnerable woman who needed his protection. She was an independent woman with choices, and one of those choices was walking away from him entirely. "I should go," Martha said, rising unsteadily to her feet. "Think about what you owe your family, Ruth, what you owe your father's memory." After her mother left, Ruth and Josiah sat across from each other at the kitchen table where they'd shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many moments of growing intimacy. Now the space between them felt vast as an ocean. "This changes things," Ruth said finally. "Does it?" "You know it does." Ruth forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm not a charity case anymore. I don't need your protection or your pity." "Pity?" Josiah's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Is that what you think I feel for you?" "I don't know what to think anymore." Ruth's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "This morning, I was grateful for every kind word, every gentle touch, because I thought they were more than I deserved. Now I have money and property and independence, and I wonder, was your kindness real, or were you just being charitable to someone who had nothing?" Josiah reached across the table, covering her hands with his. "Ruth, look at me." She raised her tear-stained face to his, seeing something fierce and determined in his dark eyes. "I fell in love with you when you had nothing but the clothes on. Your back, and the courage to defend our arrangement to the church ladies," he said. "I fell in love with your gentle hands and your quick mind and the way you hum while you cook. Your inheritance doesn't change any of that, but it changes what people will think. Let them think what they will. The question isn't what others think of your money, Ruth. The question is what you think of me. Do you believe I could pretend to love you for months? Do you think I'm that good an actor?" Ruth stared into his face, searching for deception and finding only honest emotion. The money was new, the inheritance unexpected, but the love in Josiah's eyes was as real as it had been that morning when she was poor. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of having choices, of maybe making the wrong ones, of losing you, because I don't know how to be anything other than what I've always been." Josiah stood and came around the table, pulling her into his arms with the same gentle strength that had first made her feel safe. "Then let's figure it out together. Money or no money, inheritance or not, you're still the woman I want to spend my life with." As Ruth rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, she realized that wealth's greatest gift wasn't freedom from worry. It was the freedom to choose love without desperation, to build a life based on genuine affection rather than mere survival. The inheritance had changed everything and nothing. She was still Ruth, still in love with Josiah, still hoping for a future that seemed too good to be true. But now, for the first time in her life, she had the power to make that future happen. The bundle of letters lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Josiah's study, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture and time. Ruth discovered them quite by accident while helping him search for property deeds related to her inheritance, her hand finding the slight depression in the wood that revealed the hiding place. "What are these?" she asked, lifting the bundle into the lamplight. Josiah's face went pale when he saw what she held. "Ruth, those are, I never meant for you to find them." But she was already untying the string that bound the letters together, her curiosity stronger than propriety. The first page was covered in Josiah's careful script, dated just 2 weeks after she'd arrived at his farm. "Dear Ruth," she read aloud, then stopped, her eyes widening as she understood what she was holding. "These are letters to me." "Letters I never sent," Josiah said quietly, his voice heavy with embarrassment. Letters I wrote but never had the courage to give you. Ruth sank into his desk chair, the bundle heavy in her hands. There were dozens of them, months of Josiah's private thoughts and feelings laid bare in ink and paper. She looked up at him questioningly. "May I?" Josiah nodded, though his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Ruth read the first letter in its entirety, her heart racing as Josiah's true feelings unfolded before her. Written just days after their first real conversation, it spoke of his surprise at finding someone who understood his love for the land, who could see beauty in simple things. The second letter, dated a week later, described his growing admiration for her gentle strength and practical wisdom. As she progressed through the bundle, Ruth watched their entire relationship unfold from Josiah's perspective, his initial protective instincts, his growing respect for her capabilities, his dawning realization that what he felt was more than mere compassion. One letter, written after the confrontation with the church ladies, made her eyes fill with tears. Ruth proved today that she has more courage than most people I know. She stood up to their judgment, not with anger or defensiveness, but with quiet dignity that left them speechless. I find myself wondering how I lived 52 years without knowing such a woman existed. Another, written during their winter storm, revealed the depth of his longing. She hums while she works. Did I mention that? Little melodies that turn ordinary tasks into something beautiful. This house has been silent too long, and she fills it with life in ways I never knew I needed. I want to tell her how I feel, but what right do I have to burden her with an old man's dreams? The final letter was dated just 3 days ago, written after her inheritance was revealed. Ruth has choices now, real choices, and I'm terrified she'd choose a life that doesn't include me. She could have any future she wants: travel, education, a husband more worthy of her than a middle-aged farmer with calloused hands and limited conversation. I love her enough to let her go if that's what would make her happy, but I pray God forgive me for hoping she'd choose to stay. Ruth set the letters down with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion Josiah had hidden from her for months. Every doubt, every fear, every moment of tenderness, it was all there in his careful script, a record of a heart that had opened slowly but completely. "Why didn't you give them to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Josiah sat heavily in the chair across from his desk, looking older than his 52 years. "Because they made me too vulnerable. Because I was afraid you'd feel obligated to return feelings you didn't have. Because—" he ran his hands through his graying hair. "Because I'm a coward who found it easier to love you in silence than risk losing what little I had." Ruth stood and moved around the desk, kneeling beside his chair. "Josiah, look at me." When he finally met her eyes, she saw the fear there, the same fear that had kept him alone for 15 years after Emma's betrayal. "These letters tell me that you loved me when I was nothing," she said softly. "When I was just a broken woman with nowhere to go and nothing to offer. That kind of love, it's what I've dreamed of my whole life. But now you have options." "Yes, I do." Ruth took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and gentle care. "And I choose you. Not because I need you to survive, but because I can't imagine a life that doesn't include your steadiness, your kindness, your terrible jokes over morning coffee." Josiah's eyes searched her face as if looking for doubt, for the moment when reality would crash through hope. "The community will never fully accept us," he warned. "There will always be whispers about our age difference, about how we came together. Let them whisper. We know the truth. Your mother will make life difficult. My mother has been making life difficult for 32 years. I've survived her disapproval before. Ruth, I'm asking you to tie your life to a man who's past his prime, who can't give you children, who—" Ruth silenced him by placing her fingers gently over his lips. "You're asking me to marry the man I love. Everything else is just details. We'll figure out together. The next morning brought a letter from David Richardson, pressing for an answer about selling the farm. His tone was more urgent now, mentioning investors who were growing impatient and opportunities that wouldn't wait indefinitely. "He's not wrong about the pressure," Josiah said, setting the letter aside. "Land development is coming to Lancaster County, whether we like it or not. Farms are selling for more than they're worth to farmers." Ruth studied the letter, her newly awakened business sense detecting something calculated in David's urgency. "May I see the original offer he made?" Josiah retrieved the documents from his desk, and Ruth spent the morning reviewing them with the careful attention her father had taught her to apply to financial matters. "These numbers don't make sense," she said finally. "He's offering you $20,000 for 100 acres of prime farmland, but he mentions investors willing to pay much more. Why would he lowball his own uncle? Because he assumes I don't. No better? Or because he's already promised the land to someone else at a higher price?" Ruth set down the papers, her expression thoughtful. "Josiah, what if we turn this around? What if instead of selling to David, we bought him out?" "Bought him out?" "Your farm and my inheritance together would be nearly 200 acres. That's enough land to be truly profitable, to weather the changes coming to this area." Ruth's voice grew more confident as the idea took shape. "We could modernize, expand, maybe even begin our own development housing for farm families instead of city speculators." Josiah stared at her, seeing not just the woman he loved, but a true partner, someone whose mind complemented his own in ways he'd never imagined possible. "That would mean a real partnership," he said carefully. "Not just marriage, but business. Partners as well. Is that what you want?" "Ruth, I've run this farm alone for 20 years. The idea of having someone to share both the risks and the rewards." He shook his head in wonder. "It's more than I dared hope for." Their planning was interrupted by the arrival of Elder Marcus Weaver and 2 other church leaders, their faces set in expressions of grave concern. "Josiah, Ruth," Elder Weaver began without preamble, "we need to discuss the scandal that's developed around your living arrangement." Ruth felt her newfound confidence falter slightly. Even with money and independence, the weight of community disapproval was formidable. "The situation has reached a point where action must be taken," another elder added. "Either this improper arrangement ends immediately, or we'll be forced to consider more serious measures." "What kind of measures?" Josiah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Shunning, for a start. Exclusion from worship services. Public acknowledgement that you've chosen worldly desires over godly behavior." Ruth felt anger kindle in her chest knot. The helpless fury of someone without options, but the righteous indignation of a woman who finally had the power to fight back. "And what would make our arrangement proper in your eyes?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fire burning within her. Elder Weaver looked uncomfortable. "Well, marriage would certainly change the situation. But given the circumstances of your cohabitation, many would question whether such a union could be considered blessed. Then we should give them something to really talk about." Ruth interrupted, rising to her feet with the dignity her father had taught her and the confidence her inheritance had provided. She turned to Josiah, her heart hammering but her resolve absolute. "Josiah Brenner, I've spent my entire life being told what I couldn't have, what I wasn't worthy of, what wasn't proper for someone like me. I won't spend another day letting other people's limitations define my choices." The room fell silent as Ruth continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I love you. Not because you rescued me, not because I need your protection, but because you saw worth in me when I couldn't see it myself. You treated me with respect when the world offered only pity or judgment. You gave me a place to discover who I really am." She paused, looking directly at the stunned church elders before returning her gaze to Josiah. "So I'm asking you, in front of these witnesses, to marry me. Not to quiet gossip or satisfy propriety, but because I choose you, and I want everyone to know it." The proposal hung in the air like a challenge thrown down, bold and unprecedented and absolutely right. Ruth had spent 32 years letting others make her choices. This time, the choice was entirely her own, and she was choosing love. The church meeting house had never held such a crowd. Word of Ruth's unprecedented proposal had spread through Lancaster County like wildfire, drawing curious neighbors, concerned relatives, and judgment seekers from miles around. They packed the wooden pews and lined the walls, creating an atmosphere thick with anticipation and whispered speculation. Ruth stood at the front of the assembly, her hand steady despite the hundreds of eyes focused upon her. She wore her best, dressed navy blue with simple white collar, and had braided her hair with the same care she'd taken every morning for 32 years. But today was different. Today she would speak her truth regardless of the consequences. Elder Weaver called for order, though his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The extraordinary nature of Ruth's public proposal had forced the church leadership into an uncomfortable position. They couldn't ignore such a blatant challenge to propriety, but neither could they dismiss a woman who now owned half of one of the area's most prosperous farms. "We are gathered," Elder Weaver began reluctantly, "to address the situation that has developed between Josiah Brenner and Ruth Hostetter. Allegations of improper conduct, questions of moral behavior, and the need for community standards to be maintained." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruth could see Martha in the third pew, her face set in lines of bitter satisfaction. Nearby sat several of the church ladies who had confronted Ruth months earlier, their expressions ranging from disapproval to fascination. Josiah sat in the front row, his presence a steadying force, even though he'd argued against this public confrontation. Ruth had insisted, knowing that whispered doubts would poison any happiness they might build together. Better to face the judgment head-on than spend years looking over their shoulders. "Ruth Hostetter," Elder Weaver continued, "you have requested the opportunity to address these concerns publicly. The floor is yours." Ruth rose slowly, feeling the weight of generations of women who had stood silently while others decided their fate. Today would be different. "Friends and neighbors," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "I stand before you not to ask forgiveness for choices I've made, but to tell you why I made them." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Public confession was expected. Public defense was unprecedented. 7 months ago, my mother cast me out of her house with nothing but the clothes on my back and $3 to my name. I had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no skills beyond cooking and cleaning that might earn me honest work. Ruth paused, letting her words sink in. Several women in the audience nodded slightly. They understood the precarious position of unmarried daughters in their community. Josiah Brenner offered me employment when no one else would. He provided shelter, fair wages, and something I'd never experienced before: respect. Not once in 7 months has he spoken to me with anything but kindness. Not once has he made me feel like a burden or charity case. Martha half rose from her pew, her face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful mother," Ruth said firmly, her voice cutting through the outburst. "You will have your chance to speak. Right now, it's my turn." The authority in Ruth's tone shocked Martha back into her seat. This was not the meek daughter she'd terrorized for decades. "I've heard the whispers," Ruth continued, turning back to the assembly. "I know what you think of a woman who would live in a bachelor's house, who would accept such an arrangement. You believe I've compromised my virtue, that I've brought shame on our community." The silence was absolute now, everyone straining to hear what would come next. "But I ask you this, where was your concern for my virtue when I was trapped in a house where every word was criticism, where every day brought fresh reminders of my worthlessness? Where was your protection when I faced a future of endless servitude with no hope of anything better?" Ruth's voice grew stronger, fed by years of suppressed truth. Josiah Brenner saw value in me when my own mother saw only burden. He treated me as an equal partner when the world saw only damaged goods. He offered me dignity when everyone else offered only pity. Mrs. Elizabeth Yoder stood from her seat, her face stern with disapproval. Dignity doesn't excuse impropriety. Living unmarried with a man, regardless of circumstances. What impropriety! Ruth's voice rang out with sharp clarity. What sin have I committed beyond working honestly for fair wages? What crime have I committed beyond finding joy in a life that had known precious little of it? The church fell silent again, the accusers suddenly uncertain in the face of Ruth's direct challenge. You speak of impropriety, but I see no impropriety in two people treating each other with kindness and respect. You speak of scandal, but I see only the scandal of a community more concerned with appearance than with actual virtue. Ruth paused, her gaze sweeping across the packed room. When she continued, her voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. I love Josiah Brenner, not because I depend on him for survival. I have my own means now, as you all know. Not because I have no other choices. My inheritance gives me more freedom than most women in this room will ever know. I love him because he saw worth in me when I couldn't see it myself, because he treats me as an equal partner in work and conversation, because he makes me want to be the best version of myself. The testimony was bold, unprecedented, and utterly honest. Ruth had laid her heart bare before the community that had judged her, daring them to find fault with love built on mutual respect and genuine affection. If that love is improper in your eyes, Ruth concluded, then I submit that your definition of propriety needs examination. Because what we have built together is more moral, more godly, more true than any union based on mere convention or social pressure. She sat down to stunned silence, having said everything she'd come to say. The battle for her right to choose love over conformity had begun. Josiah rose from his seat with the deliberate grace of a man who had spent years learning to choose his words carefully. The murmurs that had filled the church after Ruth's testimony died away as he faced the assembly, his weathered hands steady at his sides. I didn't ask for this public examination of my private life, he began, his deep voice carrying easily to the back of the crowded room. But since it's been forced upon us, I'll speak plainly. Elder Weaver shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly regretting the turn this meeting had taken. What had begun as a simple moral correction was becoming something far more complex. Ruth Hostetter came to my farm as an employee, Josiah continued. She earned her wages through skill, dedication, and hard work. Any man in this room would be fortunate to have such a capable worker, and I challenge anyone here to find fault with her service. Several farmers nodded grudgingly. Ruth's reputation for competence had spread beyond Josiah's farm during harvest season, but she became more than an employee. She became my friend, my companion, and eventually, the woman I love. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because I discovered in her intelligence, kindness, and strength of character that I've rarely encountered in any person. Martha Hostetter stood abruptly, her face twisted with rage. She's poisoned your mind against her own family, turned you against the woman who raised her, sacrificed for her. Martha. Josiah's voice cut through her outburst like a blade. You forfeited the right to speak of sacrifice when you spent your daughter's inheritance while keeping her in poverty and ignorance. The crowd stirred at this revelation. Many had heard rumors about Ruth's unexpected inheritance, but few knew the full details of Martha's deception. You stole from your own child, Josiah continued relentlessly. Used her father's provision for her future to control and manipulate her present. If anyone in this room has committed a true sin, it's you. Martha's face went white, then red, as the weight of public exposure crashed down on her. She'd built her authority on the fiction that Ruth was dependent on her charity, worthless without her mother's grudging support. That fiction was crumbling. before everyone's eyes. Furthermore, Josiah said, turning back to the broader assembly, I want to address the question of our sleeping arrangements, since that seems to be what concerns you most. A shocked silence fell over the room. Such matters were never discussed openly, certainly not in mixed company. Ruth sleeps in the guest room at the east end of my house. I sleep in my own room at the west end. We take our meals together. We work together. We talk together in the evenings. If you find sin in companionship and conversation, then half the marriages in this community are sinful. Mrs. Yoder rose again, her voice shrill with outrage. The appearance of impropriety is impropriety. Living under the same roof, unmarried. Then marry us, Josiah said simply. The two words dropped into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the crowd. What? Elder Weaver managed. Marry us. Right. Now, in front of everyone. Ruth has asked me to be her husband, and I accept with gratitude and joy. If our unmarried cohabitation offends you, then make us married. Ruth stood beside him, her heart racing but her resolve absolute. This wasn't how she'd imagined her wedding day. No flowers, no celebration, no joy from family and friends. But it was honest, real, and exactly what she wanted. That's not how things are done, Elder Weaver protested weakly. Why not? Ruth asked, taking Josiah's hand. We're both of age, both willing, both capable of supporting ourselves. What impediment exists beyond your disapproval of how we met? The elder looked around desperately for support, but found none. The legal and moral arguments against the marriage were thin, based more on social convention than actual doctrine. Do you have rings? Someone called from the back of the room. Ruth smiled, remembering the tin box that had caused her so much anguish weeks earlier. We do. Josiah pulled the simple gold band from his pocket, his grandfather's ring that had waited decades for the right woman. Ruth produced a matching band she'd purchased in town the day before, using money from her inheritance to buy something that belonged solely to their future together. Then what are we waiting for? Called out Heinrich Lapp, the harvest foreman, who had always appreciated Ruth's cooking. Let's have a wedding. The suggestion caught fire in the crowd. Someone began moving benches to create an aisle. Others called out offers of music, flowers from their own gardens, food for a celebration. Afterward, within minutes, what had begun as a moral inquisition was transforming into an impromptu wedding ceremony. The community that had come to judge remained to celebrate, caught up in the infectious joy of two people choosing love over convention. Elder Weaver, faced with a congregation that had clearly made its decision, sighed heavily and opened his prayer book. If we're going to do this, we'll do it properly. Josiah Brenner, Ruth Hostetter, stepped forward. As they walked hand in hand to the front of the church, Ruth felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Not tears of sorrow for the life she was leaving behind, but tears of gratitude for the miracle of being chosen by someone who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. The wooden cup that would bind them together sat on the altar, simple, practical, perfect for a love that had grown from honest work and mutual respect into something that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Ruth Hostetter was about to become Ruth Brenner, and the whole community would witness a transformation from worthless burden to beloved wife.